And I am working on an app that is multi-branded, and that is why we decided to implement screenshot testing. So when we're not busy implementing tracking libraries and ad libraries, I think everybody that works on news apps is familiar with that, we are developing all sorts of new UI elements, and the entire app has right now 5 brands with all sorts of different elements that are reused across all brands, or at least are available to all brands. But they all have different fonts, different colors, some styling elements like separators and stuff like that. And a lot of them have different constraints because they want their margins to be like 5 pixels more or less. So as you can imagine, when working on one brand, there's always a large chance of breaking something for another brand. So to very quickly or simply explain it, let's say you're working on this little title element, and you decide to possibly increase the font size. And then you run our snapshot tests, and as you can see in the background, there's a lot of red because it had some unintended side effects. Because apparently the image is related to the height of the title block, and now it's all not very pretty anymore. But it gives you a failed image, and most importantly, a diffed image, where you can really easily see what you messed up and if you want to fix it or not. This also applies to all our assets. We get all our assets from a separate team in a library. So we have control of updating the pod that contains the library, but we don't really have control over its contents. And there have been cases where aspect ratios changed in images, or they were removed entirely or substituted out for blank images because they were deprecated. And this is, again, a solution where the screenshot testing really saved our bacon. And this is a bit more of a the example we come across a lot. So I'm working on this title element, and it needs to be constrained to a set height, but it's still fine, and it was fine for all the other brands I used whilst testing the app. But then there was one brand that has the same font size, same font strength, but a higher line height. And then it gets clipped. But luckily, screenshot tests to the rescue. We get a few red lines, and we know what to fix. We don't test for accessibility, because they didn't implement accessibility in the app we're currently working on. Don't shoot the messenger. I've brought it up, but they're like, oh, well. And all the content is dynamic, so we don't really have to worry about multiple languages. It's one thing we don't have to worry about. Our building blocks are mostly Nimble snapshots, which is a library that uses iOS snapshot test case, which was originally made by Facebook and now is maintained by Uber, I believe. And then we integrate that with Bitrise, so during the build, we can see in our Bitrise log what went wrong. And you can also download a XC test report, and then you can see the screenshots in Xcode, which is quite useful. So in our app, we use a coordinator pattern, but for testing, we have a test coordinator. It uses our production data models with mock data. We use a mock view model because there's a bunch of surfaces that have never been mocked. And then we use in this case, the production article detail view. And this all lives in our main app target. This is how a spec looks like. So we have the coordinator here, and it spits out, in this case, a list teaser based on a few parameters. But the cool thing about having it live in the main app target is that on the left, we have our Figma file. And on the right, this is just the app loaded with mock data. And we can basically have the Figma file next to it. And whenever onboarding a new brand, we usually start with assets from another brand. And you can start switching out stuff and going through pages, seeing what's not right yet, instead of having to go to test articles, which was the original setup when I got here. So now you just have it all on one page, and that makes it a lot quicker to onboard all new brands because all the fonts are different, colors are different, icons are sometimes different. We've also integrated it in our CI/CD system. So whenever there's a merge request, we run a pipeline just for one brand because, yeah, the pipeline runs for every merge request, and otherwise you would be waiting on pipelines for quite a while. And we have nightly alpha builds, which run for all brands. So we do run the tests based off of the develop branch every night. And in that way, there is usually where we see our errors, when it all comes together. It's like feature X doesn't always break, but feature X and Y quite often results in shenanigans. And in the morning, we see in our Slack something went wrong, which is quite useful. There are some cons to this setup. Our bitrise builds take an insanely long time because we've covered basically almost every single element in almost every state. And all the screenshots are in isolation instead of like in overview pages. So I think a normal build takes roughly, with just the unit tests, take between 10 and 15 minutes. This takes 45-ish minutes per brand. So we're going to reach a point where we've onboarded too many brands, and like it will be an infinite cycle of waiting on bitrise builds to continue. So yeah, keep that in mind if you pay for your CI/CD. There's also, whenever you change iOS versions, you basically need to re-render all the screenshots. Also, when you update Xcode versions, you need to re-render all the screenshots. Yet, x86 to Apple Silicon seems to be completely fine. We've never encountered any problems there, which is nice. But yeah, there is a lot of manual labor, factory labor involved. We need to re-render all the screenshots. And most importantly, whenever you change an iOS version, you do sort of have to step through all of them to see if nothing really changed. You can set a tolerance, but then you wouldn't be entirely sure if your tolerance is masking stuff. And then it can always drift further and further. So yeah, I did write a quick shell script that loops over all our targets and builds it all locally so you can quickly re-render all your test screenshots. So that's pretty nice. I also have a short demo. Let's see if I can. Here's my, oops. Just full screen it. Yeah, so this is a really simple demo app that I wrote. It's basically just a label. And right now, this one test succeeds. But if you were to, for example, change the font size and run the tests. I also made a demo app so you didn't have to wait for like 10 minutes while our regular app builds. Testing. And you see the one snapshot test that exists in this app fails. And if we jump to the report, you can see the reference image. And you see the failed image where it's still relatively easy to see what went wrong, and my favorite one, the deft image, where you can really easily see if it's, how bad it is. And then based on that information, you can either decide to re-render the snapshot and as a new reference, or you can decide to fix your mistake. Yeah. Are there any questions?
How do you re-render?
Who asked that? Yeah, there. No, you basically just on the record screenshot thing, you pass through. That you can set a boolean there, you pass through. And then it, re-renders. Yeah, you can set the destination. We keep it all in our repo. We do use Git LFS for it. But we all keep the reference images in our repository. So you have to re-render them locally. You don't re-render them on the CI/CD system because that would, again, take a long time. So yeah, that's basically how it works.
So I kind of noticed that your screenshots were all full screen. But was that a screenshot test for a single component or for a whole view?
We do it mostly for single components.
And when you do it for single components, is it a screenshot of a whole simulator and a component embedded within that?
Yes.
Or is it just the component standalone?
No, it basically takes a screenshot of the view as it is rendered out. And we center the component in a collection view. I mean, you can make it with multiple components. We have a few edge cases for them. There's like 3 or 4 title variations. And then we just put them all below each other.
OK, cool. Thanks.
That was also one of my questions, because I was also wondering, do you only snapshot view components, or do you snapshot entire views?
Well,
like
no,
attached
yeah. So
views?
you could either build a view based on mock data to make your snapshots more efficient, but yeah, originally the setup was to test every component individually. And you can also test views as long as you have any way of loading them in isolation with mock data. Then you can test whatever view you want.
Yeah, we were doing the same thing, and we were also running into the fact that it would take a long time for the test to finish, and so that's why I was wondering if you guys had a strategy to watch your snapshot to watch your snapshot testing. But okay.
Luckily, the media house is willing to pay for the Bitrise setup. Yeah.
So you introduced this after the app was live, right?
Bart
so
actually introduced it originally,
okay.
but yeah.
Yeah. So how did you go about that? So you have an app, it's not optimized to maybe even render one view, etc.
It wasn't, no.
So can you tell a little bit about?
Luckily, quite a few pages already had like at least a view model, which gives you a way of injecting dummy data and rendering your views in isolation. But yeah, a lot of elements were not mocked. So yeah, we basically started writing a protocol around the view model to be able to mock it, and pulling as many singletons out of the view controller and putting them in the view model.
So how long did it take to go from 0 to 1, basically, from no?
From 0 to 1 wasn't that hard, because like a lot of the single components were already would have like a configure function where you pass in the data or the data model. But for bigger views, it took a long time because yeah, the view models were not optimized to be mocked at all.
And how did you decide where to start?
I think we started on a grid, some grid elements, because they simply were the easiest to start with.
Ah, okay.
That was, yeah. I mean, we started with the path of least resistance and the views that you see the most as the end user.
Yeah, exactly.
Because those are the most valuable, essentially.
Nice.
The example you gave of the new brand with a higher line height.
Yeah.
So that's not something you find with this, right?
It is, yeah. When you run the screenshot tests on that new brand, and you see that it clips.
Yeah, but there's
you mean if they haven't been rendered yet? No.
There's no reference yet.
No, if there's no reference, you don't find it.
So when you start with a new brand, you need to create reference images, and someone has to compare them to the Figma
But that
files.
is also why I made the overview pages. So you could easily have it next to your Figma file. I mean, of course, the Figma file also has weird stuff in it usually, which doesn't make sense, but for a developer. But yeah, you have to start with just manual labor.
Yeah, so the reference image part is the really labor-intensive part.
Yeah.
Creating those, making sure they're really correct.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Luckily, we also have a very good QA team. I mean, there's still no substitute for good QA. So they also catch a lot of stuff.
Hello.
Hello.
This style of screenshot testing is literally taking a screenshot and comparing it to another with a diff.
Yes.
And
I think it uses KSDiff under the hood.
Oh, okay. So is that looking at the sort of XML of the views and comparing constraints?
No.
Oh, okay.
It literally looks at screenshots. So it's
just
completely agnostic of what is happening behind the scenes.
Okay. So does that mean that if you, rather than like something fairly obvious to the human eye, like font size, it was font color, and there was one that was black, and then one that was slightly darker black?
That fails, yeah.
It fails, but is it easy to determine what it caused it, or do you really have to sort of dig in?
Yeah, well, at some point you would have to like if they are the exact same size, the diff is really hard to see. There are other image comparison tools, but then you would really have to dig them out of the folder where they are generated, and you wouldn't use the XC test report if you really are. I've seen like situations where between iOS 12 and 13, like there was a sub-pixel difference in font rendering.
Yeah. And do you find that you have to run it on lots of different devices to be able to, different device sizes and categories, and introduce new ones every year?
Yeah, unfortunately, we only run it on one device, but in an ideal world, you would run it on multiple devices.
Okay, because I think there are screenshot testing libraries that, rather than doing image, well, they have images to show you as well to make it pretty, but I think they check the XML of like, so you can see auto layout constraints. So I think it's sort of device agnostic, and size agnostic.
Yeah. Well, even there are like third-party outside-in plugins, which I don't remember what they are, but for automated testing, they also do constant comparison, and Xcode also has their own UI, Xcode, XE UI tests.
True, they do. Yeah.
You can use those as well, and they are you would easily be able to use a different subset of devices, and you wouldn't have to re-render it every time. But it also could hide mistakes that seem logical to a computer, like if the string is still there, but it's capped weirdly, or you didn't expect it to be on 2 lines.
We have a process, Omar.
Okay, there we go. So for this XML-based constraint checking, I think that's really dangerous because sometimes I actually want to refactor a view. For example, I want to, instead of have this view be in this view, be in another view, but I actually still want the snapshot test to pass, meaning I did the same exact thing, right? So actually, I think doing it agnostic to the constraints, but more of what's there visually, what's actually seen, has a lot of advantages, even if speed is there.
Ideally,
for
you combine the both. I mean, if you really want to. We also have automated user interaction tests running nightly, but I don't run those.
Yeah.
Those are like an outside-in thing. I'm not even entirely sure what it's called. Catalan, I think.
And since I'm holding the box, I just want to ask.
Sure.
Isn't it true that failures take much longer than successes in the snapshot test?
Yes, because it retries it a couple of times, because it is, in fact, an imperfect system. So.
And it also needs to render the diff also as a result.
Yes, and it needs to save it somewhere, like the successes are immediately deleted. But I mean, longer, no, it takes longer.
Right. So
but you would run them locally usually before you push.
And is this 45 minutes like the happy path when there's no failures, or is when it?
Well, I think it's between 40 and 45. It also depends on how many tests fail. If you have if 80% of the tests fail, it would take a very long time for it to complete. If 2 or 3 fail, it's super close to your happy path.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So how many UI tests do you do?
I would have to check, but it is, I think, 203 or something like that, from the top of my head. And every time we're adding more. Whenever a state of the object, I mean, the app has been around for a long time. There are components that have states that I've never seen. And sometimes they are used very sporadically. And when we see it go wrong, we write another run.
So that means that with 5 brands, and ideally 1 or 2 phones that you test every year, you have to update thousands of tests. Can't you automate that?
It is automated.
Okay, because you said if a test fails, you have to add that file to the reference directory. I would sort of say, create reference build.
No, that's how it works. You have one mother of all Boolean. If you set that to true, it essentially re-renders all the images. But even GitHub and most Git repositories are smart enough to see if an image is exactly the same. It wouldn't see it as a new image. So you don't see it in your diff. So you only see the actually changed images in your diff. Cool. So that makes it easy to step through. And and I wrote a script that loops over all the brands and re-renders all the images. Thank you.
Hey, I was wondering, is there any pain points when you're supporting screenshot testing for localizations, or for example, you're supporting 3 different languages?
Well, we don't have any localization differences. They are all Belgian apps, and they're only run in Flemish, I guess. You would have to redo all your tests for every localization if you have non-dynamic content. I mean, all the content in our app is essentially dynamic, so everything can be any string, so we don't test for different localizations. But yeah, you would 205 tests for what would be for one language, so you would essentially have 205 more for any other language. And you would also have to re-render those. And I'm sure your builds would take much longer then. At that point, it might make sense to start combining it all into a view, and that way you can make smaller snapshot tests, which are slightly less flexible.
All right, thank you.
Hi. Do you use that for Swift UI apps or mostly for UI view?
Sorry, what did you say?
Do you use that for Swift UI views or?
This is all UI kit.
UIKit.
Yeah, because up until very recently, we had to support iOS 12.
So yeah, but that Facebook library is quite old, right? Are there anything like more suitable for Swift UI, or is it the same?
I don't think there's a reason you couldn't use it for Swift UI. I mean, as long as you have the ability to run a launch a view in isolation, you can run a snapshot test over it.
Yeah, but I thought that the Swift UI is more declarative, so I thought that there may be more like comparing the code base itself would be enough for Swift UI, maybe.
Yes, that's actually, I've never thought, I mean, I don't use Swift UI a lot in production because iOS 12, but that would be interesting, but you would run into the same problems as XCUI tests where something will look fine in code and still, I mean, even UIKit and still behaves in weird and unexpected ways sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, that might be a way to do it a bit quicker. And also, you already write your Swift UI views in a way that it's easier to inject data into them. So.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Does your Android team also run UI snapshot test?
What did you say?
Android
Android
the
team.
Android team. Do they
there was
also
a talk here about snapshot testing for Android a little while ago. They were written for Android. The problem is there's weird differences between computers. It's like going from Apple Silicon to x86 Macs. There are imperceivable differences between the snapshot tests. So you would have to always render them on your dedicated CI/CD setup if you want like one single source of truth. And I believe there were some other gotchas, but the Dutch Android user group, I don't know if they record their talks, but they had a talk on it a couple of weeks ago.
Thanks a lot for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Presentation.
Thank you.
I think we've learned a lot. Let's have a little break.
Yeah.
Before we,
and I put the tiny demo app on my GitHub, and it's literally the only thing on my GitHub, so it's really easy to find. The only public thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.